In the misty highlands of Western Ireland, archaeologists Barry Cunliffe carefully brushed centuries of accumulated earth from what appeared to be a carefully arranged circle of standing stones, each no taller than a man's waist, yet positioned with astronomical precision that would challenge modern surveyors. The site at Dromburg, discovered in the early 20th century but only recently subjected to rigorous stratigraphic analysis, revealed beneath its seemingly simple stone circle a complex of ritual deposits, cremated human remains, and bronze artifacts that spoke to a sophisticated religious hierarchy operating across the Celtic world for over a millennium. As Cunliffe's team employed ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry to map the subsurface features, they uncovered evidence of repeated ritual activity spanning from approximately 1100 BCE to 400 CE, a timeline that encompassed the rise and fall of the enigmatic priestly caste, known to history as the Druids. The material assemblage recovered from the site included bronzed works, bearing intricate Latin artistic motifs, iron sickles with traces of mistletoe resin still clinging to their blades, and most remarkably, a series of wooden tablets inscribed with Ogham script that appeared to record astronomical observations and seasonal calculations of stunning precision. These discoveries at Dromburg represented merely one node in a vast network of sacred sites, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Ireland and Brittany to the forests of Bohemia and the mountains of Anatolia, all bearing the distinctive hallmarks of Druidical influence: circular or oval temenos spaces, evidence of ritual feasting, deposits of metalwork and human remains, and most significantly, astronomical alignments that demonstrated a profound understanding of celestial mechanics and seasonal cycles. The Druids emerged from the broader Indo-European religious traditions that had been developing across Europe since the Bronze Age, but their particular synthesis of natural philosophy, legal expertise, poetic tradition, and priestly authority represented something unprecedented in the ancient world, a scholarly and spiritual elite whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of individual Celtic tribes and kingdoms. Archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest recognizable Druidical practices began to crystallize during the Late Bronze Age transition period, roughly contemporaneous with the emergence of the Hallstatt cultural complex around 1200 BCE, when Celtic-speaking populations were consolidating their control over much of temperate Europe. The proto-Druidical religious specialists of this period appear to have synthesized indigenous European religious traditions, particularly those centered around sacred groves, springs, and hilltop sanctuaries, with incoming Indo-European concepts of cosmic order, divine kingship, and sacrificial ritual, creating a distinctive theological and philosophical system that would dominate Celtic intellectual life for the next 15 centuries. Evidence from sites such as the Humenberg Hillfort in southwestern Germany, where archaeologists have uncovered a complex of structures that appear to have served both as elite residences and ritual centers, suggests that the earliest Druids functioned not merely as priests, but as advisors to Celtic chieftains, legal arbitrators, teachers, and custodians of oral tradition, roles that would remain central to Druidical identity throughout their historical existence. The material culture associated with these early Druidical sites reveals a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy, particularly in the production of ritual objects such as cauldrons, torques, and ceremonial weapons that frequently bear astronomical and seasonal symbolism, suggesting that from their earliest emergence, the Druids conceived of themselves as intermediaries between the human and cosmic orders. Isotope analysis of human remains from Druidical burial sites, dating to the Late Bronze Age, indicates that these religious specialists enjoyed a diet rich in imported goods and exotic foods, further evidence of their elevated status within Celtic society, while the presence of amber from the Baltic, jet from Yorkshire, and gold from Ireland in their grave assemblages demonstrates the extensive trade networks through which Druidical influence spread. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age around 800 BCE marked a period of intensified Druidical activity, as evidenced by the proliferation of ritual sites and the increasing sophistication of the material culture associated with them, suggesting that the social and economic upheavals of this period may have enhanced, rather than diminished, the importance of religious specialists capable of maintaining social cohesion and legitimating political authority through appeals to divine sanction and ancient tradition. The consolidation of recognizable Druidical institutions during the early Iron Age coincided with the emergence of the Latin cultural complex around 450 BCE, a period that witnessed unprecedented artistic and intellectual flowering across the Celtic world. Much of it centered around the sacred sites and educational institutions maintained by the Druids themselves. Archaeological investigations at major Druidical centers such as Anglesey in Wales, known to the Romans as Mona and described by classical authors as the most sacred of all Druidical sanctuaries, have revealed complex landscapes of ritual activity including processional ways, artificial pools for ritual purposes, and most remarkably, extensive deposits of metalwork that appear to represent deliberate offerings to deities associated with water and the underworld. The recovery from the waters around Anglesey of hundreds of bronze and iron objects, including swords, spears, cauldrons, torques, and horse equipment, many showing evidence of deliberate damage before deposition, provides material confirmation of the classical accounts describing Druidical practices of ritual sacrifice and offering that were central to their religious system. Palynological evidence from peat cores taken near these sites indicates significant landscape modification during the Iron Age, including the creation and maintenance of sacred groves through selective forest management, the construction of artificial clearings for ceremonial purposes, and the establishment of herb gardens containing plants with known medicinal and magical properties, all of which speaks to the Druids' role as environmental managers and custodians of natural knowledge. The Druids of this period appear to have maintained extensive libraries of oral knowledge covering law, history, genealogy, medicine, astronomy, and poetry, with classical sources indicating that the most accomplished Druids might spend 20 years in formal training, memorizing vast corpora of traditional knowledge that were never committed to writing, but passed down through successive generations of carefully selected and rigorously trained initiates. The geographical distribution of Druidical sites during the Latin period reveals a sophisticated network of communication and coordination that stretched across the entire Celtic world, with evidence of shared ritual practices, artistic traditions, and astronomical knowledge appearing at sites separated by thousands of miles, suggesting that despite the political fragmentation of the Celtic world, the Druids maintained a form of institutional unity that transcended tribal and territorial boundaries. Recent advances in genetic analysis applied to human remains from Druidical burial sites have revealed patterns of mobility and intermarriage that confirm the classical accounts describing the Druids as an international caste whose members might travel freely between different Celtic territories, serving as diplomats, judges, and teachers without regard for local political divisions. The Druids of this period also appear to have maintained extensive contacts with the Mediterranean world, with archaeological evidence indicating knowledge of Greek and Roman philosophical and scientific traditions that were incorporated into their own teaching and practice, though always within a distinctively Celtic framework that emphasized the sanctity of the natural world and the importance of maintaining proper relationships between human communities and the divine forces that govern the cosmos. The material culture of Druidical sites from this period reveals increasing sophistication in the use of astronomical alignments with stone circles, timber circles, and constructed earthworks demonstrating precise knowledge of solar and lunar cycles, equinoxes and solstices, and the precession of celestial bodies that enabled the Druids to maintain accurate calendars and predict eclipses, knowledge that enhanced their authority as mediators between human society and the cosmic order. Evidence from sites such as Newgrange in Ireland where recent archaeological work has confirmed the monument's use as both a burial site and an astronomical observatory throughout the Iron Age, suggests that the Druids inherited and maintained much older traditions of landscape-based astronomy while developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for recording and transmitting this knowledge across generations. The political and social organization of the Druidical hierarchy during its classical period, roughly from 300 BCE to 100 CE, represented one of the most sophisticated intellectual institutions of the ancient world, with archaeological and literary evidence indicating a complex system of ranks, specializations, and educational pathways that enabled the Druids to fulfill multiple roles as priests, judges, teachers, healers, astronomers, and political advisors throughout the Celtic world. Excavations at sites such as the Gournay-sur-Erin sanctuary in northern France have revealed evidence of structured educational activities including purpose-built lecture halls, libraries for storing ritual objects and teaching materials, and residential quarters for students and teachers, suggesting that major Druidical centers functioned as universities, where young people from across the Celtic world gathered to receive advanced education in law, medicine, natural philosophy, and the sacred arts. The material assemblages from these educational sites include writing tablets, mathematical instruments, astronomical devices, and medical equipment that demonstrate the practical and scientific dimensions of Druidical education, while the presence of pottery and metalwork from across Europe confirms the international character of these institutions and their role in maintaining cultural unity across the politically fragmented Celtic world. The Druids appear to have been organized into several specialized branches, each with its own particular responsibilities and areas of expertise. The Druids proper, who served as priests and judges, the Vates, who functioned as diviners and prophets, and the Bards, who maintained the oral traditions of poetry, history, and law that formed the foundation of Celtic cultural identity. Archaeological evidence from burial sites suggests that advancement within the Druidical hierarchy was based on demonstrated competence and lengthy periods of training, rather than hereditary privilege. Though genetic analysis indicates that certain families may have maintained traditional connections to Druidical institutions across multiple generations, the legal authority of the Druids extended beyond religious matters to encompass virtually all aspects of Celtic society, with classical sources indicating that they served as the supreme arbitrators in disputes between individuals, families, tribes, and even kingdoms, and that their decisions carried divine sanction that made them virtually unappealable. Evidence from legal texts preserved in later Irish and Welsh manuscripts, which appear to preserve much older oral traditions, reveals a sophisticated system of Celtic law that governed property rights, personal relationships, political obligations, and religious observances, all administered by Druidical judges whose authority derived from their mastery of ancient precedents and their ability to interpret the will of the gods. The economic position of the Druids within Celtic society appears to have been secured through a combination of voluntary offerings, formal tribute from political rulers, and rights to agricultural produce from lands held in sacred trust, with archaeological evidence from Druidical sites indicating levels of wealth and luxury that rivaled those of the highest political elites. The international connections of the Druidical hierarchy are demonstrated by the discovery at Celtic sites of goods and materials from across the known world, including silk from China, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, and spices from India, all of which appear to have been channeled through Druidical networks that operated parallel to, and sometimes in competition with, purely commercial trade routes. The political influence of the Druids reached its zenith during the period of Roman expansion into Gaul, when they served as the primary organizers of Celtic resistance and maintained networks of communication and coordination that enabled tribes separated by hundreds of miles to act in concert against the common threat of Roman imperialism. The Romans themselves recognized the Druids as the most dangerous opponents of their conquest plans. not merely because of their role as military advisors and resistance organizers, but because their authority provided an alternative to Roman law, Roman religion, and Roman concepts of political legitimacy that threatened the entire imperial project in Western Europe. The encounter between the Celtic Druids and the expanding Roman Empire during the 1st and 2nd centuries BC initiated a prolonged struggle that would ultimately determine the fate of indigenous European religious and intellectual traditions, with archaeological evidence from this period revealing both the resilience and the ultimate vulnerability of Druidical institutions in the face of systematic imperial persecution. The earliest Roman accounts of the Druids, preserved in the writings of Julius Caesar, Tacitus, and Pliny the Elder, present a complex and often contradictory picture of Celtic religious specialists who combine sophisticated philosophical and scientific knowledge with practices that Romans found both fascinating and abhorrent, particularly the alleged practice of human sacrifice that served Roman propaganda purposes, while also reflecting genuine cultural differences and approaches to religious ritual and divine communication. Archaeological investigations at sites such as the Riabemont-sur-Ancre sanctuary in northern France have provided material evidence for large-scale ritual activities during the period of Roman conquest, including deposits of human and animal remains that appear to represent sacrifice and ritual feasting on a massive scale. Though recent analysis suggests that many of these deposits may represent post-battle ritualization of warfare casualties rather than the systematic human sacrifice described in Roman sources. The Roman systematic campaign against Druidical institutions began with Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE, during which Roman forces deliberately targeted sacred sites, destroyed ritual centers, and executed Druidical leaders. Recognizing that the political and cultural authority of the Druids represented the primary obstacle to the romanization of Celtic populations, evidence from sites such as the Gournay-sur-Aran sanctuary shows clear archaeological signatures of violent destruction during this period, with layers of ash and debris containing Roman military equipment overlying deposits of Celtic ritual material, providing material confirmation of the classical accounts describing the systematic destruction of Druidical institutions during the Gallic Wars. Despite these early setbacks, archaeological evidence indicates that Druidical practices persisted in modified forms throughout the period of Roman occupation, with excavations at rural sites revealing the continued use of traditional ritual practices, the maintenance of sacred groves and springs, and the production of distinctively Celtic religious artwork that incorporated Roman stylistic elements while preserving essential aspects of pre-Roman religious symbolism. The final Roman assault on organized Druidism came during the governorship of Suetonius Paulinus in Britain, when Roman forces launched a deliberate campaign to destroy the sacred island of Anglesey and eliminate the last major center of Druidical authority in the Western Celtic world. Excavations on Anglesey have revealed extensive evidence of this Roman assault, including layers of burned material containing military equipment, the deliberate destruction of ritual sites, and the hasty burial of sacred objects that appears to represent desperate attempts by the Druids to preserve their most precious religious artifacts from Roman destruction. The aftermath of the Roman conquest witnessed a complex process of cultural negotiation and adaptation, with archaeological evidence indicating that while organized Druidism was effectively eliminated as a political and legal institution, many aspects of Druidical knowledge and practice were absorbed into Romano-Celtic religious synthesis that emerged during the early imperial period. Sites such as Bath in England and Chemalières in France reveal the development of hybrid religious traditions that combined Roman institutional forms with Celtic deities, rituals, and sacred sites, suggesting that while the Druids themselves may have disappeared, much of their religious and cultural knowledge was preserved in new forms, adapted to the realities of Roman rule. The persistence of Celtic religious traditions is further evidenced by the continued use of traditional sacred sites the production of Celtic religious art within Roman stylistic frameworks, and the preservation in later Irish and Welsh literature of what appear to be much older druidical traditions of poetry, law, and natural philosophy that had somehow survived the period of Roman persecution. The transformation and survival of druidical traditions during the Roman imperial period reveals the remarkable adaptability and persistence of Celtic intellectual and religious culture, even in the face of systematic persecution and the destruction of traditional institutional structures. Archaeological evidence from Romano-Celtic sites across Gaul and Britain indicates that while the Druids as an organized priestly caste disappeared from the historical record, many of their roles and functions were assumed by new forms of religious specialists who operated within the framework of Roman imperial religion, while maintaining essential elements of Celtic sacred tradition. Excavations at sites such as the temple complex at Trier in Germany have revealed sophisticated sacred architecture that combines Roman construction techniques with Celtic sacred geometry, suggesting that former druidical sites were often transformed into Romano-Celtic religious centers that served similar functions while operating under imperial sanction. The material culture from these hybrid sites includes votive offerings, religious sculptures, and inscriptions that demonstrate the continued vitality of Celtic religious concepts, particularly the veneration of natural forces, seasonal cycles, and local deities associated with specific landscapes, all of which have been central to druidical practice. Epigraphic evidence from across the former Celtic world reveals the persistence of Celtic divine names, ritual practices, and sacred sites throughout the Roman period, with inscriptions frequently invoking Celtic deities alongside Roman ones, and employing formulaic language that appears to preserve older oral traditions of prayer and invocation. The archaeological record also indicates that certain aspects of druidical practice, particularly those related to medicine, astronomy, and natural philosophy, continue to develop within Romano-Celtic intellectual circles, with evidence of continued innovation in metallurgy, ceramic production, and agricultural techniques that appear to build upon earlier Celtic traditions, while incorporating Roman technological advances. Recent isotope analysis of human remains from Romano-Celtic sites has revealed patterns of mobility and cultural exchange that suggest the existence of informal networks connecting Celtic communities across the Roman Empire, possibly representing the survival of ancient druidical connections in new forms, adapted to imperial conditions. The transition from paganism to Christianity during the late imperial period created new opportunities for the preservation and transmission of druidical traditions, as Christian missionaries and converts sought to understand and sometimes incorporate pre-Christian religious concepts into their new theological framework. Archaeological investigations at early Christian sites in Ireland, Wales, and Brittany have revealed clear continuities with pre-Christian sacred sites, including the reuse of stone circles and sacred groves as locations for churches and monasteries, the adaptation of Celtic seasonal festivals into the Christian liturgical calendar, and the preservation of pre-Christian oral traditions within Christian literary and educational contexts. The early Christian literature of Ireland and Wales contains extensive references to Druids and Druidical practices, generally presented in a negative light as representatives of paganism, but preserving detailed descriptions of their activities, beliefs, and social roles that provide invaluable evidence for the reconstruction of Celtic religious and intellectual history. The figure of Merlin in Arthurian literature appears to represent a literary synthesis of Druidical traditions with Christian and classical elements, suggesting that memories of the Druids continued to influence European intellectual culture long after their historical disappearance. The medieval Irish legal traditions preserved in manuscripts such as the Brian Law Codes contain extensive material that appears to derive ultimately from Druidical legal traditions, including sophisticated systems of property law, personal relationships, and political obligations. that demonstrate the continuing influence of Celtic intellectual traditions within Christian medieval society. Recent archaeological work at sites such as Glendalough in Ireland has revealed evidence of continuity between pre-Christian and Christian scholarly traditions, including the preservation of astronomical knowledge, medical practices, and poetic techniques that may ultimately derive from Druidical sources, suggesting that the conversion to Christianity may have preserved as much Druidical knowledge as it destroyed. The archaeological rediscovery of the Druids during the modern period began with the antiquarian investigations of the 17th and 18th centuries, when scholars such as John Aubrey, William Stukeley, and Edward Lyde began to apply systematic methods of observation and documentation to the study of ancient monuments that had long been associated in popular tradition with Druidical activity. Stukeley's detailed surveys of Stonehenge and Avebury, conducted between 1720 and 1740, established many of the methodological principles that would guide later archaeological investigation of prehistoric religious sites, including the importance of accurate measurement, the recognition of astronomical alignments, and the correlation of archaeological evidence with historical sources. The Romantic revival of interest in Celtic culture during the 18th and 19th centuries led to increased archaeological attention to sites associated with the Druids. Though much of this early work was hampered by Romantic speculation and nationalist ideology that often obscured rather than illuminated the historical reality of Celtic religious practices, the development of scientific archaeology during the 19th century, particularly through the work of scholars such as Sir John Lubbock and Augustus Pitt Rivers, established the stratigraphic methods and typological analysis that enabled archaeologists to distinguish between different periods of activity at complex sites and to correlate material evidence with historical sources in more rigorous ways. The discovery of the La Tène site in Switzerland in 1857, which gave its name to the characteristic art style of the late Iron Age Celts, provided the first clear material evidence for the sophisticated artistic and technological achievements of the Celtic world that had produced the Druids. Excavations at major Celtic sites such as Halstead in Austria, Mont-Lassois in France, and Danebury in England revealed the complex social hierarchies, extensive trade networks, and sophisticated material culture that characterized Celtic society. During the period of Druidical influence, the application of radiocarbon dating methods from the 1950s onward enabled archaeologists to establish much more precise chronologies for Celtic sites and to correlate archaeological evidence with historical sources in ways that had not previously been possible. Air photography and geophysical survey techniques developed during the 20th century revealed the extent and complexity of Celtic sacred landscapes, including processional ways, ritual enclosures, and astronomical alignments that had not been visible through conventional excavation methods. Recent advances in environmental archaeology, including pollen analysis, soil chemistry, and isotope studies, have provided detailed evidence for the ways in which the Druids and their communities modified and managed their natural environment, including the creation and maintenance of sacred groves, the cultivation of ritual plants, and the construction of artificial landscapes for ceremonial purposes. The development of experimental archaeology has enabled researchers to test hypotheses about Druidical practices through the reconstruction and use of ancient technologies, including metalworking techniques, astronomical instruments, and ritual equipment that provide insights into the practical dimensions of Celtic religious and intellectual culture. Modern archaeological investigations have also benefited from collaboration with scholars in related disciplines, including historians, linguists, anthropologists, and astronomers, enabling more comprehensive and nuanced interpretations of the archaeological evidence. For Druidical activities, the application of DNA analysis to human remains from Celtic sites has provided unprecedented insights into the population movements, social relationships, and cultural connections that shaped the Celtic world during the period of Druidical influence. Recent excavations at sites such as the Heathrow Temple complex in London and the Gournay-sur-Arende sanctuary in France have employed the full range of modern archaeological techniques to reveal the sophisticated ritual activities, educational functions, and international connections that characterize major Druidical centers during their classical period. The evidence for Druidical astronomical knowledge represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Celtic intellectual achievement, with archaeological investigations at stone circles, burial sites, and other sacred monuments revealing sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that enabled the Druids to maintain accurate calendars, predict eclipses, and coordinate ritual activities across vast geographical distances. The most famous example of Druidical astronomical knowledge is Stonehenge, where decades of archaeological investigation have revealed multiple phases of construction, spanning nearly 1,500 years, each incorporating increasingly sophisticated astronomical alignments that demonstrate the continuity and development of Celtic astronomical traditions from the Neolithic period through the height of Druidical influence. Recent laser scanning and photogrammetric analysis of Stonehenge has revealed previously unrecognized alignments with minor lunar phenomena, suggesting that the monument functioned as a comprehensive astronomical computer, capable of tracking multiple celestial cycles simultaneously. The discovery of similar astronomical alignments at Celtic sites across Europe, including the stone circles of Scotland and Ireland, the Hilfords of Central Europe, and the sacred enclosures of Gaul, indicates that astronomical knowledge was a central component of Druidical education and practice throughout the Celtic world. Archaeoastronomical analysis of sites such as Newgrange in Ireland has revealed not only solar and lunar alignments but also possible correlations with the precession of the equinoxes and other long-term astronomical phenomena that would have required centuries of systematic observation to detect and understand. The Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet discovered in France in 1897 and inscribed with what appears to be a sophisticated lunisolar calendar system, provides direct evidence for the mathematical and astronomical sophistication of Druidical timekeeping, including the use of intercalary periods to maintain synchronization between lunar months and the solar year. Recent computer modeling of the Coligny calendar has revealed its remarkable accuracy, with error rates that compare favorably to modern astronomical calculations, and suggest that the Druids possess mathematical techniques for calendar calculation that were not matched in the Mediterranean world until the development of Islamic astronomy in the medieval period. The archaeological evidence for Druidical astronomy extends beyond monumental architecture to include portable instruments such as bronze discs with astronomical markings, stone spheres with carved alignments, and wooden staffs with measurement marks that appear to have functioned as field instruments for astronomical observation and calculation. Isotope analysis of these astronomical instruments has revealed that they were manufactured from materials gathered from across the Celtic world, suggesting that astronomical knowledge and instrument making were centralized activities coordinated by the Druidical hierarchy and distributed to local communities through their educational and religious networks. The seasonal festivals of the Celtic calendar, including Samhain and Beltane and Lughnasadh, appear to have been timed according to astronomical phenomena rather than fixed calendar dates, with archaeological evidence indicating that major Druidical sites were designed to highlight these seasonal transitions through dramatic lighting effects and shadow patterns that enhance their religious and symbolic significance. Recent excavations at Celtic sites have revealed evidence of systematic astronomical observation, including purpose-built observation platforms, sightlines marked by standing stones or timber posts, and record-keeping systems that employed Ogham script and other forms of notation to preserve astronomical data across generations. The persistence of Celtic astronomical knowledge is evidenced by its influence on later European scientific traditions, including the astronomical methods employed by early Christian scholars in Ireland and the continued use of Celtic seasonal calculations in agricultural and religious contexts throughout the medieval period. The material culture associated with Druidical practices reveals the sophisticated technological and artistic achievements of Celtic civilization, with archaeological assemblages from sacred sites demonstrating mastery of metallurgy, ceramic production, textile manufacture, and other crafts that supported both the practical and symbolic dimensions of Celtic religious and intellectual life. The most distinctive artifacts associated with Druidical activities are the elaborate bronze and gold torques that served both as symbols of religious authority and as repositories of sacred knowledge, with recent analysis revealing that many of these objects incorporate astronomical alignments, mathematical proportions, and symbolic imagery that encoded aspects of Druidical teaching and belief. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in a Danish bog but clearly of Celtic manufacture, represents perhaps the most complete surviving example of Druidical religious art, with its complex iconography depicting scenes of ritual sacrifice, divine transformation, and cosmic order that provide invaluable insights into Celtic religious concepts and practices. Metallurgical analysis of Celtic religious artifacts has revealed sophisticated alloying techniques that produce bronze with specific acoustic properties for ceremonial bells and horns, precise magnetic characteristics for divination instruments, and distinctive visual effects for torques and other ornamental objects that enhance their symbolic and ritual significance. The discovery of Druidical workshops at sites such as Gournay-sur-Erin has revealed the complex production processes involved in creating religious artifacts, including the use of lost wax casting techniques for intricate bronze work, sophisticated enameling methods for decorative effects, and precise mathematical calculations for achieving proper proportions and alignments in finished objects. Archaeological evidence indicates that Druidical craftsmen maintained extensive networks for obtaining raw materials, with Celtic sites yielding amber from the Baltic, jet from Yorkshire, coral from the Mediterranean, and precious metals from across Europe, suggesting that the production of religious artifacts required coordination and planning on a continental scale. The ceramic assemblages from Druidical sites reveal sophisticated pottery traditions that combine functional and symbolic elements, including vessels designed for specific ritual purposes, architectural ceramics for sacred buildings, and miniature objects that appear to have served as votive offerings or teaching aids. Recent analysis of Celtic metalwork has revealed evidence of deliberate recycling and ritual destruction, with many objects showing signs of careful dismantling and reuse that suggests the Druids maintained sophisticated concepts of the sacred life, cycles of material objects, and their appropriate treatment at different stages of ritual and practical use. The textiles associated with Druidical sites, preserved through waterlogging or mineralization, demonstrate advanced weaving techniques and dyeing methods that produce clothing and ceremonial fabrics of remarkable quality and complexity, including garments that appear to have been designed to create specific visual effects during ritual performances. The wooden artifacts from Celtic sacred sites, including ritual staffs, ceremonial weapons, and architectural elements, reveal sophisticated carpentry techniques and understanding of wood properties that enabled the creation of objects with specific acoustic, structural, and symbolic characteristics required for different aspects of Druidical practice. The discovery of Druidical libraries, including the famous wooden tablets from sites such as Vindolanda and the wax tablets from Gaulish sanctuaries, provides direct evidence for the literary and intellectual activities of the Druids, revealing their use of both imported writing systems and indigenous scripts for recording legal precedents, astronomical observations, and religious teachings. The preservation of organic materials in waterlogged contexts at sites such as Flag Fen has revealed the full complexity of Druidical material culture, including basketry, leather goods, wooden tools, and plant remains that demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of natural materials and their properties that enabled the Druids to create the full range of equipment required for their religious, educational, and practical activities. The influence of Druidical traditions on later European intellectual and religious development represents one of the most significant, but often overlooked, aspects of European cultural history, with evidence for the persistence and transformation of Celtic knowledge systems throughout the medieval period and into the modern era. The conversion of the Celtic world to Christianity during the 4th through 7th centuries created complex processes of cultural negotiation and synthesis, with early Christian scholars in Ireland, Wales, and Brittany preserving and adapting aspects of Druidical learning, while rejecting others as incompatible with Christian theology. The Irish monasteries of the early medieval period appear to have served as repositories for much older traditions of learning, including mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge that may ultimately derive from Druidical sources, with manuscripts such as the Book of Bailey Mote and the Leb or Nahuidra containing material that appears to preserve pre-Christian oral traditions within Christian literary frameworks. The legal traditions of medieval Ireland and Wales, preserved in manuscripts such as the Brehon Laws and the Welsh Law Books, contain extensive material that appears to derive from earlier Druidical legal systems, including sophisticated concepts of property rights, personal relationships, and political obligations that demonstrate the continuing influence of Celtic intellectual traditions within Christian medieval society. Recent analysis of early medieval Irish literature, including the Ulster cycle and the mythological cycle, has revealed extensive preservation of what appear to be much older oral traditions that may ultimately derive from Druidical storytelling and historical preservation, suggesting that the conversion to Christianity may have preserved as much Celtic intellectual culture as it eliminated. The astronomical traditions of medieval Europe, particularly those developed in Irish and Welsh monasteries, show clear continuities with earlier Celtic practices, including the use of sophisticated calendar systems, precise astronomical observation techniques, and mathematical methods for predicting celestial phenomena that appear to build upon foundations established during the Druidical period. The medical traditions of medieval Celtic societies, preserved in manuscripts such as the Rosa Anglica and the Welsh medical texts, contain extensive material derived from pre-Christian healing practices, including sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and diagnostic methods that may ultimately trace their origins to Druidical medical knowledge. The persistence of Celtic artistic traditions throughout the medieval period, including the distinctive interlaced patterns, zoomorphic imagery, and spiral motifs that characterize Irish and Celtic Christian art, suggests that fundamental aesthetic and symbolic systems developed during the Druidical period continue to influence European artistic development long after the historical disappearance of the Druids themselves. The revival of interest in Druidical traditions during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, particularly among scholars such as John Dee, William Camden, and John Aubrey, led to renewed investigation of Celtic monuments and the preservation of traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Though much of this work was influenced by Romantic speculation and nationalist ideology that often obscured the historical reality of Celtic culture, the influence of Druidical traditions on modern European intellectual development can be traced through the work of scholars such as Edward Williams Iolo Morgan, whose preservation and promotion of Welsh bardic traditions helped to maintain continuity with older Celtic literary and intellectual practices, though his work was often supplemented with inventive material that makes it difficult to distinguish between authentic tradition and romantic recreation. The archaeological rediscovery of Celtic civilization during the 19th and 20th centuries has provided increasingly solid evidence for the sophistication and importance of Druidical intellectual achievements leading to greater recognition of their contributions to European cultural development and their continuing relevance for understanding the deep historical roots of European intellectual traditions. The legacy of the Celtic Druids extends far beyond their immediate historical context to encompass fundamental contributions to European intellectual, religious, and cultural development that continue to influence contemporary thought and practice in ways that are only beginning to be fully understood and appreciated. Archaeological evidence accumulated over more than 2 centuries of systematic investigation has revealed the Druids to have been not merely primitive priests or barbarian shamans, as they were often portrayed in classical sources, but sophisticated intellectuals whose achievements in astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and natural philosophy rivaled those of their contemporaries in the Mediterranean world, while maintaining distinctive Celtic approaches to the integration of spiritual and material knowledge. The educational institutions maintained by the Druids appear to have functioned as Europe's first universities, providing advanced instruction in multiple disciplines to students drawn from across the Celtic world and establishing traditions of scholarly inquiry and debate that would later influence the development of medieval European educational systems. The legal traditions developed and maintained by the Druids provided foundations for sophisticated systems of property law, personal relationships, and political organization that continued to influence European legal development long after the Druids themselves had disappeared from history, with elements of Celtic legal thinking detectable in legal systems from Ireland to Central Europe. Throughout the medieval period, the astronomical achievements of the Druids, preserved in the stone circles, burial monuments, and sacred sites they constructed and maintained, represent some of the most sophisticated prehistoric scientific instruments ever created, with levels of precision and complexity that required centuries of systematic observation and mathematical calculation to achieve. The religious and philosophical systems developed by the Druids provided alternative approaches to understanding the relationship between human society and the natural world that emphasize the interconnectedness of all life and the importance of maintaining proper balance between human activities and natural processes, concepts that have gained renewed relevance in contemporary discussions of environmental ethics and sustainable development. The artistic traditions fostered by Druidical patronage produce some of the most distinctive and influential art styles in European history, including the Latin artistic tradition that combines Celtic, Mediterranean, and other influences into a coherent aesthetic system that continued to influence European art throughout the medieval period and beyond. The linguistic and literary achievements of the Druids, including their development of sophisticated oral traditions for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations, provided foundations for the rich literary traditions of medieval Ireland, Wales, and other Celtic regions that have continued to influence European literature up to the present day. The medical and scientific knowledge developed by the Druids, including sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and natural processes, contributed to the development of European medical and scientific traditions that have had lasting influence on European intellectual development. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new aspects of Druidical achievement and influence, suggesting that our understanding of their contributions to European cultural development is still incomplete and likely to undergo significant revision as new evidence becomes available. The persistence of interest in Druidical traditions among contemporary scholars, artists, and spiritual seekers demonstrates the continuing relevance of Celtic intellectual and religious traditions for addressing contemporary questions about the relationship between human society and the natural world, the integration of spiritual and material knowledge, and the development of sustainable approaches to cultural and economic development that respect both human needs and environmental limits.